The 3-year-old baby keeps pointing at his father's coffin. What happens next is shocking. The gray sky wept the morning Lucas Hargrove was buried. Rain drizzled softly onto the rows of dark umbrellas lining the cemetery, each one sheltering a mourner dressed in black. Beneath one of them stood Eliza, his widow, her arms wrapped tightly around their 3-year-old son, Noah. Her eyes were vacant, hollowed by grief, her breath shallow from hours of suppressed tears. Lucas had died in a car accident just 5 days earlier. A sudden, senseless tragedy that left no time for goodbyes. One moment he was driving home from work, and the next he was gone, crushed beneath twisted metal and shattered glass. The news had torn through Eliza like a blade. Now, she stood in front of his closed coffin, trying to make sense of the finality of it. Noah, in his tiny black jacket and untied shoes, didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't understand the depths of what had happened. Instead, he clung to Eliza's side, unusually quiet, until he pointed. It happened as the pastor recited a final prayer. Noah, who had been resting his cheek on his mother's shoulder, suddenly lifted his hand and pointed his little finger directly at the coffin. "Eliza," whispered her sister from beside her. "Is he pointing at something?" Eliza glanced down, startled by the sudden motion. "Sweetheart, what is it?" Noah didn't answer. He just kept pointing, straight at the polished oak coffin that held his father. And then he said something that chilled her to the bone. "Daddy's talking." A gust of wind swept through the graveyard, as though nature itself had gasped. Eliza froze. "What did you say, honey?" Noah pointed again, more insistently this time. "Daddy's in there. He's talking to me." The people around them shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. A few exchanged sympathetic looks. Eliza tried to keep her voice steady, even as her heart began to race. "Noah, Daddy's sleeping now, remember? He can't talk." "No," Noah shook his head with determination. "He's telling me things. He said to tell Mommy not to be scared." Eliza knelt down, gripping his shoulders. "Sweetheart, what else did he say?" Noah's eyes, so like Lucas's, stared deeply into hers. "He says he didn't crash. Someone made his car fall." Eliza blinked. "What do you mean?" Noah looked down at his shoes, suddenly shy again. "He's cold. He's waiting." The funeral ended in a daze. The coffin was lowered, the mourners dispersed, and Eliza was left with questions she couldn't ask and a child who had seen. What? That night she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Noah's tiny voice echoing in her head. Someone made his car fall. Was it just a child's imagination? A way to cope with loss? Or something more? She went to check on him just after midnight. His nightlight glowed faintly in the corner of the room. Noah was curled up beneath a blanket printed with cartoon dinosaurs, his plush bear clutched in one arm. Eliza leaned over and kissed his forehead. His eyes fluttered open. "He's still talking," Noah whispered. Eliza's heart jumped. "Who is? Daddy?" Noah murmured, his voice a sleepy hush. "He says the man in the blue jacket hurt him." Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, her blood running cold. "What man, baby?" Noah turned his head and pointed, again the same motion as earlier, slow and deliberate, toward the window. Eliza turned her gaze and saw nothing but darkness beyond the glass. "He was in Daddy's car," Noah added quietly. "He pushed something." Eliza didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, she had convinced herself it was grief. Children absorb emotions, process them in strange ways. He was just trying to understand why his daddy wasn't coming home. But later that day, when Eliza was speaking with the insurance agent about the accident, something Noah said came back to her with startling clarity. He said the man in the blue jacket hurt him. The report hadn't mentioned another person. Lucas had been alone in the car. Or at least he was supposed to have been. "Could you send me the details of the police report?" she asked the agent. There was a pause. "Of course, Mrs. Hargrove," the man replied a little too quickly. "But I should warn you, the report is fairly conclusive. Single vehicle accident. No signs of foul play. Still, that evening, the report landed in her inbox. And there, buried in the witness statements, was a small detail. A blue jacket was found tangled in the passenger side door. Eliza's hands trembled as she reread the line. According to the official story, Lucas had been alone. But what if he wasn't? What if Noah wasn't imagining anything at all? And what if Lucas really was trying to say something? Eliza hadn't told anyone about the jacket. She sat at the kitchen table long after Noah had gone to bed. The police report open in front of her, its clinical language at war with the dread coiling tighter in her chest. She stared at the sentence over and over. A blue jacket was found tangled in the passenger side door. It was a throwaway line in a list of seemingly irrelevant details, the kind investigators often overlooked. But it wasn't irrelevant to her. Not anymore. Not after Noah. Lucas had no reason to be driving anyone home that night. His colleagues had already confirmed he left the office alone. And yet, a jacket. Passenger side. Why hadn't that raised alarms? She grabbed her phone and typed a message to Detective Darren Kovac, the officer listed at the bottom of the report. Hi, this is Eliza Hargrove, Lucas Hargrove's wife. I have some questions about the accident. Please call me when possible. She hit send, then stared at the screen, waiting for a response that didn't come. Not that night. The next morning, Noah was quiet. Too quiet. He sat at the breakfast table, poking at his cereal with a spoon, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. Eliza watched him with a growing sense of unease. Did you sleep okay? She asked gently. He nodded but didn't meet her eyes. Noah, she said, lowering her voice, is Daddy still talking to you? He looked up slowly, his big brown eyes solemn. He's sad. Why is he sad? Noah hesitated. Because you're not listening. Eliza's breath caught. What do you mean? He says he was going to tell you something, Noah said, fidgeting with the hem of his pajama sleeve. But now he's stuck. Stuck. That word lingered like fog in her mind all day. At noon, her phone finally rang. Detective Kovac. Mrs. Hargrove, came a gravelly voice on the other end. I just got your message. What can I help you with? She forced calm into her voice. There was a jacket found in my husband's car. Passenger side. Do you know who it belonged to? There was a long pause. We weren't able to identify it, Kovac admitted. There were no labels, no wallet, no phone. We assumed it was an old coat. Might have been his. Eliza pressed her fingers into her temples. It wasn't his. Are you certain? He didn't own a blue jacket. Could have borrowed one. No, she said sharply. He hated blue. Another silence. Look, the detective finally said, his tone shifting. We didn't find fingerprints, DNA, or evidence of a second passenger. The brakes failed on a slick curve. That's all we know. But it wasn't all she knew, because a 3-year-old boy had said otherwise. Detective, did you ever consider foul play? She asked. There was a sigh on the other end. We did our due diligence. But there was no reason to suspect murder. No enemies. No financial troubles. Your husband had a clean life. Except he didn't. Not completely. Eliza remembered the text messages she'd seen 2 months before the accident. A name she didn't recognize. Meet me tonight. She can't find out. She had confronted Lucas, and he'd dismissed it as a misunderstanding with an ex-client. And she had believed him. Or had she? That afternoon, after picking Noah up from daycare, Eliza sat him down in the living room. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the floor. Noah, she said carefully, when you said someone hurt Daddy, what did he look like? Noah didn't answer right away. He tilted his head like he was listening to something, then turned toward the fireplace. He says he had a scar on his neck. Like a line. Eliza blinked. A scar. Noah nodded. Daddy says he knew him from before. A man who was mad. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Lucas hadn't talked much about his past. Eliza knew he had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes until he aged out. There were gaps in his story, parts of his early life he never discussed. Could this be someone from back then? She stood up, her mind racing. That evening, after putting Noah to bed, Eliza pulled out Lucas's old laptop. It had sat untouched since the accident, the charger stuffed behind his desk. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, emails, documents, anything, but she felt like she had to try. The computer was password protected. For a moment, panic bloomed in her chest, but then she remembered. Noah's birthday. Lucas used it for everything. She typed it in. The desktop flickered to life. Her fingers hovered over the touchpad. She opened the email client first. Most messages were business-related, marketing updates, investor notes, routine chatter. Nothing unusual. Then she noticed a folder in his documents labeled Ghost 91. Her pulse quickened. She clicked it open. Inside was a single document, untitled. She opened it, and there it was, a journal entry, written in Lucas's voice, dated 3 days before the accident. I saw him today, after all these years. I didn't even recognize him at first. He was heavier, older, but that scar. It was him, Jamie Lorne, from Ridgewell. I should have told Eliza about Ridgewell a long time ago. But how do you tell someone you've seen someone die and stayed silent? Jamie never forgot. He said he just wants to talk. But there's something in his eyes, something I don't trust. If anything happens to me, start with him. Eliza sat frozen, the words blurring on the screen. Jamie Lorne, a name she'd never heard before. Ridgewell? And then a noise behind her. She turned sharply. Noah stood in the hallway, barefoot, holding his plush bear. Eliza? He whispered, voice small and shaking. What is it, baby? His lower lip quivered. Daddy says the man with the scar is watching our house. Eliza froze. Noah stood in the hallway like a ghost, his little arms clutching the worn plush bear to his chest, his wide eyes shining with something she had never seen in him before. Not sadness, not confusion, but fear. The man with the scar, he whispered again. He's outside. Eliza's mouth went dry. Slowly, she rose from her seat and walked toward the window. The house was quiet, the only sound the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Outside, the streetlights bathed the neighborhood in a soft yellow glow. The sidewalk was empty. The street was still, but her skin prickled with unease. She looked back at Noah. Did you see someone, sweetheart? He shook his head. Daddy did. He says he's looking for you. Eliza bent down and pulled him into her arms. His small frame trembled. It's okay, she whispered, stroking his hair even though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. You're safe here. But was she? That night, she locked every door twice, drew the curtains tight, and placed a chair under the doorknob of her bedroom. Noah slept beside her, his little hand tangled in hers, while she stared at the ceiling, the image of that journal entry burning in her mind. Jamie Lorne, Ridgewell, a man with a scar. She had no idea what Ridgewell was. Town? Institution. But it was clear Lucas had feared this man. Feared him enough to leave a warning. If anything happens to me, start with him. Eliza didn't sleep. Not even for a minute. The next morning, she dropped Noah off at daycare and headed straight to the police station. Detective Kovac met her in his office, raising an eyebrow when he saw her. I'm guessing this isn't a social visit, he said. Eliza didn't sit. You told me Lucas didn't have enemies. You were wrong. She placed a printed copy of the journal entry on his desk. He scanned it, his expression tightening with every line. I found this on his laptop, she said. Does the name Jamie Lorne mean anything to you? Kovac rubbed the bridge of his nose. I'm familiar with Ridgewell. It was a juvenile correctional facility, shut down a decade ago after reports of abuse. Some pretty bad stories came out of there. And Jamie? Kovac hesitated. Lorne was in the system, in and out of Ridgewell. Multiple arrests. Assault, petty theft, drug charges. Last known address was in Bridgeport, about 2 hours north. Eliza leaned forward. He was in Lucas's car that night, wasn't he? We don't know that. You found a blue jacket. Lucas didn't own one. My son, 3 years old, has described a man with a scar twice. And now he says he's watching our house. Kovac looked up sharply. Noah saw someone? No. Lucas did. He told Noah. Kovac's skepticism was obvious. With all due respect, Mrs. Hargrove, that's not admissible. I don't care if it's admissible, Eliza snapped. I care if it's true. Kovac looked at her for a long moment. Then he sighed. I'll see what I can find on Lorne. That evening, Eliza returned home with Noah and tried to act normal. She cooked dinner, let him watch his favorite cartoon, then tucked him into bed. But all the while, she felt watched. Every shadow outside the window looked darker than it should have. Every car that slowed down on the street made her heart race. She double-checked the locks again before going to her room. Her phone buzzed around 10:30. A text from an unknown number. You should have left it alone. She stared at the screen, hands trembling. Then another message came in, this one with a photo. A blurry shot of her and Noah leaving the daycare that morning. Eliza dropped the phone. She didn't call the police. Not yet. Her mind was spinning too fast, working through scenarios, trying to find a thread she could pull. Something that would unravel the truth before it was too late. Lucas had mentioned a death. You've seen someone die and stayed silent. Who? When? She needed to understand what happened at Ridgewell. The next morning, she called in a favor from an old college friend who now worked in investigative journalism. Within an hour, her friend sent over an archived news article from 15 years ago. Tragedy at Ridgewell. 17-year-old dies in alleged fight with inmate. The boy's name was Marcus Devlin. The inmate who had allegedly fought with him? Jamie Lorne. No charges were filed. There were claims of self-defense. But rumors suggested another boy had witnessed the fight. Someone who kept his mouth shut when questioned. Lucas. Eliza sat at the table, heart hammering in her chest. What if Jamie blamed Lucas for staying silent? What if he thought Lucas owed him something? What if Lucas had finally refused? And now he was gone. She opened Lucas's laptop again and searched the name Jamie Lorne. There wasn't much. An old mugshot. A few scattered mentions in court documents. But there was one link. A YouTube channel. A single video. She clicked it. It was a shaky cell phone recording. A man speaking into the camera. Late 30s, unshaven, wild eyes. A scar slashing across the left side of his neck. Jamie. Sometimes people think they can erase the past, he said. But the past don't forget. Especially when you leave someone behind to take the fall. The video cut off suddenly. Eliza sat frozen. Then her phone rang. Blocked number. Against her better judgment, she answered. Eliza, came a deep voice on the other end. He tried to warn you, but you didn't listen. She stood, her hand trembling. Jamie, pause. You should be careful where you dig. The more you uncover, the closer I get. And then, click. Eliza didn't sleep that night either. Noah tossed and turned in his bed beside her, mumbling things she couldn't understand. At one point, just before dawn, he sat up straight and whispered into the darkness. He's almost here. Dawn broke pale and cold. The light filtering through the bedroom curtains had a strange, sterile stillness, as if the world was holding its breath. Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, staring at the floor. Beside her, Noah stirred, letting out soft murmurs in his sleep. One word repeated again and again. Ridgewell. She had to end this. Jamie Lorne wasn't going to stop. Not while she was digging. Not while Lucas's secrets were unraveling thread by thread. And now, with that chilling phone call, she knew he was watching her. Somehow, someway, he was near. She waited until Noah was awake, dressed him, and dropped him off at her sister's house across town with strict instructions. Keep the doors locked. Don't let him out of sight. Her sister had seen her shaken before, but never like this. Then Eliza drove. She didn't know where exactly she was going at first, just that it started with a name. Ridgewell. It took 2 hours to reach it. A crumbling facility deep in the countryside, swallowed by overgrown weeds and silence. The gates were rusted, the sign hanging by a single bolt. It had been closed for years, condemned, forgotten by the system that had once poured troubled youth into its cold walls. But the memories, they remained. Eliza parked a few hundred feet away and made her way through a gap in the fence. Her boots crunched over broken glass and fallen leaves. The air smelled of damp decay and old regret. The main building loomed in front of her, its roof partially caved in, graffiti marring the exterior. But it wasn't the building that stopped her. It was the sound. A whisper, faint, barely more than the rustling of leaves. She turned. There, just beyond the broken basketball court, stood a figure. A man. He wore a navy windbreaker, jeans, a baseball cap pulled low. But even from a distance, Eliza saw it, the scar slicing down the left side of his neck. Jamie Lorne. He didn't move. He just watched her. Eliza's instincts screamed to run. But her grief, her anger, her need for answers rooted her in place. Slowly, she stepped forward. "You followed me here," she called, her voice steady despite the tremble in her chest. Jamie tilted his head. "You came to me. You killed Lucas." He snorted, a humorless laugh. "No. Lucas killed himself the moment he stayed quiet." "What are you talking about?" Jamie took a step closer. His eyes were wild but clear, like someone who'd spent too long in his own mind. "Ridgewell, 2008. Marcus Devlin didn't fall. He didn't trip. I didn't kill him." He pointed a trembling finger at her. "Your husband did." Eliza's breath caught. "What?" He snapped. "He lost it. Marcus was a bully, yeah, but Lucas..." He pushed him. Hard. "We were all there. I tried to stop him. But when the guards came, he lied. Told them I did it. And they believed him. He let me rot in solitary. Let them beat me half to death. And then he left. Got out. Got rich. Forgot." Eliza shook her head. "That's not possible. Lucas. He wasn't violent." Jamie laughed again. "He wasn't. Until he was. That place changed people. Turned kids into monsters. He tried to make amends years later. Wrote me. Tried to send money. I told him I didn't want it. I wanted the truth." "So you killed him," she said, cold creeping into her veins. Jamie's eyes darkened. "I didn't touch him, but I scared him. I got into his car. Told him I wanted justice. Told him if he didn't tell you the truth, I would." He panicked. Swerved. We crashed. I climbed out. Left the jacket. "You ran. I survived." Eliza's legs felt weak. Her world was shifting, cracking under the weight of this new truth. "He was going to tell me," she whispered. Jamie nodded. "He said so. But he waited too long." Eliza swallowed hard. "You scared my son. You've been watching us." Jamie's gaze softened just a fraction. "Your boy looks just like him. I thought if I saw him, I'd hate him. But I didn't. I saw a kid. Innocent. And it made me realize, maybe I didn't want revenge anymore." "Then why the messages? The photos?" Jamie looked down. "To make sure you took it seriously. To lead you here. To make you listen." She stared at him, unsure whether to believe him, unsure what to do next. "I should turn you in," she said quietly. Jamie shrugged. "Go ahead. But remember, Lucas took that secret to his grave. If you want the world to know the truth, then tell it. But if you want your son to grow up with peace, maybe let him remember the father who loved him. Not the boy who made a terrible mistake." He turned then, walking back into the trees, his footsteps swallowed by silence. Eliza stood there for a long time, the wind brushing her hair, tears streaking her cheeks. That night, as she returned home, she found Noah asleep in his bed, peaceful for the first time in days. When she kissed his forehead, he stirred and whispered, "Daddy says thank you." Eliza blinked, startled. "For what?" Noah smiled faintly in his sleep. "For setting him free." 2 weeks passed. The nightmares stopped. Noah, once restless and haunted by whispers in the dark, slept peacefully now. His little limbs sprawled across his bed, as if the weight of invisible voices had finally lifted. Eliza watched him more often than she used to, longer, softer. realizing that in his innocence, he had been a vessel for something far greater than he could understand. Lucas was gone, but not lost. In the quiet, in the stillness of her home, Eliza began to feel him again. Not as a voice echoing through their child, not as a memory trapped in pain, but as presence. A warmth, a watchful calm. The truth had come and shattered her world. But from the pieces, something new began to take shape. She didn't report Jamie. Not yet. She thought about it. Every day. But something inside her, something Lucas had left behind in Noah, and maybe even in her, told her that vengeance wasn't the same as justice. Lucas had made a mistake. Terrible one. But he had tried to make it right. And in the end, he'd paid the price for the silence he'd carried for so long. She wasn't going to let their son carry the rest. Not the guilt. Not the darkness. She told him one night, when the stars were scattered like glass across the sky. They sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket, Noah's head resting on her arm. "Do you remember what you told me at the cemetery?" she asked gently. "That Daddy was talking?" he murmured. "Yes." He nodded almost dreamily. "He said not to be scared." Eliza looked up, blinking away the sting in her eyes. "He was right. You don't have to be scared anymore." Noah was quiet for a moment. "Is Daddy okay now?" She pulled him closer. "I think he is. I think he finally found peace." "Did you find it too?" She smiled, the kind of smile that breaks and heals all at once. "I'm getting there." A few days later, she opened her laptop and started typing. Not for the police, not for revenge, but for truth. A long, careful letter, addressed to Marcus Devlin's family. She told them everything. About Ridgewell, about the fight, about Lucas's silence, and about Jamie. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She only offered truth, because the weight of secrets was something she could no longer bear. Not for herself, not for Lucas, not for her son. She mailed it the next morning. And that night she dreamed. In the dream, she was standing in a field of wildflowers. The sun was low, painting everything gold. And across the field, walking toward her, was Lucas. Whole, young, smiling. Behind him, Noah ran, laughing, chasing a red kite. Lucas stopped in front of her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just looked at her, the way he used to when words weren't necessary. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked away, his form fading into the sun. When she woke up, her pillow was damp with tears, but her heart felt light. One final thing remained. The grave. Eliza hadn't gone back since the funeral. But now it didn't feel like a place of pain anymore. She brought Noah with her. The cemetery was quiet, wind whispering through bare trees. The headstone was simple: Lucas Hargrove, beloved husband, devoted father. Noah laid a toy truck at its base, a gift, he said. So Daddy won't be lonely. Eliza knelt beside him, placing a hand on the cold stone. "I understand now," she whispered. "All of it." Noah looked up at her. "Can he hear you?" "Yes," she said, tears shining in her eyes. "I think he always could." They stood together for a while, silent. The wind danced around them, lifting leaves and memories alike. And then, softly, like the final note of a lullaby, Noah smiled. "Mommy," he said. "He's not stuck anymore."